It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, it's 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID livestream series 20, episode 6 starts here. And welcome to episode 120, ladies and gentlemen. Gosh, what's been going on in the course of the last week in markets? Well, it's been very, very exciting. The head of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, Terry Duffy, has said that he and the new Chicago mayor don't agree on anything. The love has clearly gone in the Windy City, ladies and gentlemen, and LTEL is firing warning shots left, right, and centre. Quite understandable too. His property leases for CME Group are all ending in 2025 across the board, leaving the what was once called Chicago Mercantile Exchange in pole position to vault towards an anti-crime, pro-business metropolis state, or to encourage some form of government outbreak amongst the doctrinaire spendthrift lunatics who masquerade as city and state governments in Chicago and Illinois respectively. Meanwhile, over in Africa, there are moves to try and push the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, ECX, into a merger with the East African Commodity Exchange, EAX. I'm not entirely convinced that we improve markets this way. Surely the local price is key, and a vast regional price is just a freight arbitrage, which will leave some very, very frustrated. However, before we get to that, we will be introducing our guest in a few moments, and I'm sure he's going to have a much, much better perspective than me because he's an expert in the field. Meanwhile, over at ASX, the RBA has marked their report card, and it looks quite dismal, ladies and gentlemen, not encouraging at all. Wow. Meanwhile, look out for it tomorrow on Exchange Invest and BitCarnage, our Substack devoted to crypto markets. We have a very, very interesting position. I believe we may have reached a crypto extinction level event. More in tomorrow's newsletter for subscribers. If you're not a subscriber, go to exchangeinvest.com and sign up. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are discussing commodities markets. We're on the road with Gravelet-Blondin. The agricultural derivatives market in South Africa grew from nothing to a world market trading futures and options contracts in grains in the space of 5 years. A system of warehouse receipts was developed for delivery in the market, and traded volumes increased from a total of 3,343 contracts in 1996 to 1,969,346 contracts by 2002, just 6 years later. This week's IPO video is talking to the man who went on the road to make that growth happen. Rod Gravelet-Blondin has a lifetime of experience in agricultural economics, having been agricultural councillor at the South African mission to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, responsible for South African representation at what was then the GATT, now better known as the WTO. Subsequently, he was agricultural councillor at the South African mission to the European Union in Brussels in Belgium, responsible for agricultural relations between South Africa and the European Union. Thereafter, and that's a huge amount of our discussion today, Rod made a significant and magnificent, it has to be said, career quantum leap, becoming the marketing and product guru of the South African Futures Exchange, SAFEX, in 1995, where his legendary road trips built a market across the vast geography of South Africa. Rod, welcome. It's lovely to see you. Where in the world are you today?
Well, not far from where I started. I am in Pretoria, and fortunately not in the dark, although we are scheduled to go into the dark in about 1 hour's time. I am one of the few who have an inverter, so I can escape the darkness and at least watch the cricket. But that's where I am in Pretoria, one of the capitals of South Africa, and about 40, 45, 50 kilometers north of Johannesburg, where it all happened. And I commuted for 20 years. And thank goodness I don't commute anymore. I'm retired, and I am happy to be in Pretoria, where I am tonight and where you find me.
Pretoria, what a lovely place, Rod. But it is really such a shame what we've seen over the course of, well, when I was first visiting South Africa and you were going such great guns with Safex at the start of this century, I have to say, such a magnificent country. I'm so sorry that the last 2 decades haven't been more of an upward tilt in growth for all, whereas it seems to have become rather becalmed, which is such a tragedy.
Sure.
That is a topic that we could. So tell me, Rod, how did you manage to get into this whole wonderful world of agriculture?
Well, I guess it all started because although I had illusions of going into law or commercial law, I discovered that one of the easiest subjects in the final year of university happened to be agricultural economics, which took my fancy, and I ended up at the Department of Agriculture in South Africa. And a few years later, I think because I am basically of British origin and speak English, I was asked to go overseas, as you mentioned in your introduction, to Brussels and to Geneva and serve as attaché and counselor in that space. That's really my introduction to agriculture and where I was really doing marketing and I suppose representation for South African agriculture.
Yes, it's quite interesting. I mean, a lot of people don't understand the way that all of the different nations work in different ways. But as I recall, Brazil, they ran their European Union agriculture actually out of Dublin, and every different nation in the European Union had some sort of a speciality. And there's a huge amount of work that has to be done there, if nothing else, to stop the European Union from going all super protectionist over everybody and causing all sorts of problems, which is obviously a huge issue for a very heavily agricultural-based economy such as South Africa.
Yeah, it had its interesting times negotiating apple quotas when the European Union was trying to force what they called CA apples, controlled atmosphere, apples down the Europeans' throats, and then the 5 Southern Hemisphere countries with their fresh apples had to negotiate a quota. In those days, we were all friends when it came to the global quota of all 5, but it was a real humdinger to try and sort out amongst ourselves who was going to get what part of that quota. And of course, the appellation and the naming of wines and cheeses was another interesting aspect. But yeah, it's had its interesting parts. Towards the end, I was in Europe from 1980 to 1990, rather pariah years for South Africa, and sometimes it was a difficult period, but a good period to learn and still have many wonderful friends in Europe.
Well, I mean, a very dynamic time for Europe, a very dynamic time for South Africa, but then you went back to South Africa. And actually, in many ways, that was when the really exciting period, in my mind, began for agriculture, because obviously the new South Africa simply couldn't afford to operate under the previous regime. And I don't mean under apartheid, I mean under the financing of agriculture.
Sure. I came back to South Africa in 1990, spent 4 or 5 years helping with the transition in agriculture with the new government coming into power, and doing a lot of international negotiations with them, holding their hands, as it were. And then, as you say, the whole landscape of agriculture changed, moving from a whole system of boards. I think South Africa was probably the number 1 country with control boards, related to be known as marketing boards. We had boards for literally every product, from bananas to cheese, and of course the large grain boards. But they were largely instrumental in setting prices and basically managing the risk in agriculture, the price risk in agriculture, not the weather risk, obviously, the price risk. And with the change in policy, the boards were done away with, and all of a sudden agriculture had a whole new landscape to work through, and that was the landscape of price risk, a very new setup, and one where, in a sense, helped me launch an exchange.
So yes, a whole new world of price risk had to be hedged. And actually, I'm just going to stop you for 1 second because greetings from Chicago. Greetings, Rod, from an old colleague in Chicago, Anne Berg, another great dynamo of the global commodities markets. Do please ask a question if you get a chance later, Anne. It's lovely to see you this evening. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching this show, don't forget to leave us a little bit of love, please. The AI, the wonderful algo bots, they respond to likes and love quite considerably, and we want to try and get this seen by as many people as possible. So do please like this episode and feel free to ask Rod a question, whether you're watching us this evening on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube. So Rod, put that into, as I remember, you can put that into a spectacular raw money question, because the old-fashioned boards were offering quite a substantial, effectively, there was quite a substantial fixed cost for transacting. And then you had to move everything onto exchange and things rather collapsed.
Well, yeah, the two things that collapsed in a sense was, boards had the advantage. There was a wonderful statistics base. If you channel everything through a single channel, you do have very good statistics. And that was probably a big pro for the boards. But obviously, when it comes to price of commodities, that was largely became, as it has throughout the world, who have similar interventionist systems, very political. And instead of moving from a floor price, you move very quickly into a market price. And so let's take maize for an example. A lot of large farmers in South Africa were politically orientated, and therefore the price determined by the government was largely a political tool used. One of the reasons why the new government decided, in my view, to do away with the boards was to move politics out of it. But what it did do, we lost some good statistics. We made up very quickly with them, but it did expose particularly farmers to this whole new world where price risk became a reality. There's some comfort when everybody's getting the same price. It might not be the best price, but there's some comfort in it. All of a sudden, when farmers were responsible not only for producing the product, but also for managing their price risk, it was a huge learning curve. But, and I must stress this, it was great timing to start an exchange. So yes, I appreciate that maybe I had to work hard to get it going, but the timing was a major factor. There was a real objective, and I think that's missing in many exchanges today, startup exchanges. What are you really trying to achieve? And the objective that we put on the table was to enable the management of price risk.
I think that's a very interesting point, and we can break it down in a couple of ways. But so let's just go to the history. So let me see. If memory serves me correctly, then were you called up by, was it Stuart Rees? Was it the CEO of Safex at the time, and he invited you to join, or how did you move mellifluously from the government into Safex?
An interesting story, and we could talk a lot about that. But basically, it came about. Safex itself, the South African Future Exchange, although many people now think of it purely as an agricultural exchange, actually started as a financial exchange with Stuart Rees at the helm. And it moved out from Rand Merchant Bank into Safex as an organization. Then there was this view with the changing political landscape and agricultural landscape that perhaps Safex should look into a commodity division within the exchange. And what was interesting is that there was a lot of reticence as to whether that would ever be a profitable venture. And so Safex Agriculture, or the Safex Agriculture division, actually started out as almost a separate unit, selling its own seats to raise capital. And although closely linked to the financial markets, it was a separate entity as such. And yes, you're quite correct. Stuart Rees called me up and asked me if I had any interest in joining the new venture, the Agricultural Markets Division. I must give credit to John Wixley, who was my predecessor, who was a very, very clever gentleman. And the seats were sold, and the Agricultural Markets Division of Safex was started up. Yeah.
Yes, so that, you're absolutely right. And actually, I'd forgotten, I must admit, all about John Wixley, because he really did all of the work to set things up, but really didn't see that much trading go on under his suzerainty of the division. He got everything set up, and then you came in. And now tell us about that, because you mentioned earlier you had this fascinating situation with, you wanted to manage price risk, you had to educate the farmers. And really, the farmers knew, and I don't mean this in any nasty sense, they knew nothing about the newfangled world of hedging their price risk through derivatives. So that gave you a big problem. And obviously, South Africa is a huge, vast, incredible country. So how did you go about solving the problem of educating the market?
You know, I was fortunate in the set. Not only was the timing opportune, but because we had a futures market which was financial and had many financial members who then took up a seat or membership of the agricultural division, that, and I'm still perhaps old-fashioned, but a strong believer in startup, in a mutual organization. I believe that with skin in the game, it helps a lot. And the financial members and the other members, but the financial members particularly, were a great help. You know, I could try my best to go and speak at a Farmers' Day, but I was very, very unknown, and no one really knew, as you correctly said, anything about how a derivatives market works. So who the hell was going to come and listen to Rod Blondin? However, if your bank manager of the little town where you farm nearby said, well, we are sponsoring a Farmers' Day, and we might give you a brandy and Coke, and we might even put some boerewors, a variety of sausage, onto a fire. We want to discuss financial issues, and guess what? Rod Blondin is going to come and talk to us and explain to us. So that was a very, very important vehicle that was at my disposal to go. And I say this with all honesty, I went with this whole idea that I would travel anywhere, anytime, to go and speak to farmers. All I wanted was no money, maybe a bed to sleep, but not even that, but just the opportunity to spread the word as it is. And I think that was made an impact, on the sense that one, I came with the bank manager. Secondly, I was very honest in spreading, and it was marketing, but largely, as you mentioned, Patrick, it was also educating. It was educating as to how the system would work. And once you targeted one or two large farmers, perhaps the more progressive farmers in the area, who understood the concept, that was where the breakthrough came. And although at times, you know, it was difficult, I think many people have heard the story of how I was called the Antichrist, because somehow this newfangled market of futures and options was going to lead to the downfall of farmers. I remember a farmer coming up to me once at a show and telling me that my name would be on the gravestones of thousands of farmers in South Africa. But once people understood, and once they saw that the system could work, but again, I stress, it was to manage price risk. And yes, of course, you need speculators. We know how a market works. But the farmer needed a mechanism to manage his price risk, and he needed to understand it. And that, I think, was a major step forward, having that environment in which to work and being willing to make use of it.
And it came with an incredible change in the financial dynamics, if I remember correctly. I mean, I'm going to try and quote you back, but you're going to correct me, I'm sure. If I seem to remember, it was a bushel the difference was previously it cost 500 Rand effectively to process it through the old board, and you ended up, I think it was like 150 or 250 or 5 Rand or something when it went through the exchange, something like that.
Well, it was a different cost structure, as you say. You see, for the board to operate and to have a set price, each ton of maize, bushel of maize, whatever you want to call it, was subject to a subsidy to keep the board going, but also to allow the market to work. So if there was a surplus of maize, then the international price was low, there was a subsidy that was needed, and that was basically paid for by the farmer. So there was always that cost involved. If there was a shortage of maize and maize had to be imported, corn had to be imported at a higher price, then the subsidy that was collected with every ton of maize that went through the market in South Africa was used to subsidize the price. And basically, that subsidy was done away with. Of course, farmers were very ingenious in trying to get around. They would lease land, or they would do this and do that to try and get around paying the subsidy. But when they realized that you could actually market maize without a subsidy and only pay the transaction costs, that, as you said, went a long way towards a financial boost for them, because the cost of marketing was getting more and more expensive as the subsidy grew to maintain the structure of the board.
We're discussing today, ladies and gentlemen, commodities markets. We're on the road with Rod Gravelet-Blondin, where we're looking back to his amazing career in markets as he went through, well, I think he traveled to every corner of South Africa at some point in time. And I mean, Rod, it is quite remarkable, your ability to cover miles. I remember we came back one time from a conference in Sun City and a great conversation from Sun City back to Johannesburg. And I genuinely think you drove more miles than anybody in the history of financial futures markets, commodities futures markets, whatever, because you had a remarkable ability to go all the way to Durban, across the country, back down again. It was amazing.
Yeah. I guess it was, but it was a case of dedicated personnel. We believed in what we were doing. We were called, as I said, a lot of different names, but we believed in what we were doing. And once we got some progressive farmers on board, it made a major difference, I believe. But yeah, I traveled a vast amount of miles. I never really kept track of it because that wasn't really the importance. I remember I had, I think, one of the first Nokia cell phones that ever came out. It was about the size of a brick. I remember that, and I remember stopping along the way, miles away from Johannesburg, just to call to find out if any contracts had traded and what price they had traded at, because that was a major selling card to tell people that we'd actually traded a contract, and this was the price, and this is what it meant to the farmer and in the farmer's pocket. Yeah.
So tell us, what were the initial contracts that you were actually out there on the road marketing on behalf of SAFEX?
Contract specs, or
what were the futures? Because you had maize, and what did you have others?
Yeah, well, we actually started with a cash settled potatoes contract. Never traded one contract. It was, I think, the best contract in paper. It really was a great paper contract. It was a cash settled contract. We actually had a system called the National Average Potato Price Index. For our British listeners, that translated into the NAPI, which was a catch-all. But we never traded one contract, and that just goes to show that sometimes a contract can be very well written and look good on paper, but never really takes ground. And then we started with a beef contract. The beef contract probably traded 10 contracts, if that. There was also cash settled, but the price that we were using to settle against was being manipulated in the cash market, so it lost credibility. And so that puts me on to the fact that we went on to maize, which was a physically delivered contract. And the whole aspect of credibility, I can't stress credibility enough. For a startup exchange, when you're working with farmers who know the land, who work hard, who work up a sweat, you have to maintain credibility. And another boon for us, and I can talk a lot about this because I think it's one of the problems we have in a lot of other parts of Africa, is we did have very, very good storage facilities. We had very good grading facilities. And so we had a system of what were initially cooperatives, which turned into agricultural businesses. And so that was a major, I think, plus factor for us to have the storage to provide the credibility into the maize market. And because maize was so important, that was really the contract that took hold. It was a futures contract in maize at 100 tons. And then, I want to say the rest is history, but we did go into sunflowers and wheat and international contracts. But it was the maize contract based, I think, largely on the need for price risk, the fact that we had financial members in the market, we had good storage facilities, good grading facilities, a dedicated bunch of people who would go the extra mile to emphasize and to explain what the market was all about. And that, I think, was the basis and the foundation of the success that we enjoyed.
So it's very interesting. You talk about the credibility of the market, the element of trust, which I think everybody appreciates is vitally important. But it's interesting that you have a series of networks that were vitally important. The banks would come into SAFEX as a financial product, and obviously the SAFEX bond futures were hugely successful throughout the time that we're talking about here in parallel. But having the banks to introduce you to the major players in the agricultural world, and that allowed you to then build that network in each of the different regions. But going out and building that network, then at the same time having this network of storage, and that really, really interests me, because we've obviously seen a lot of commodity markets hugely undermined by storage issues. And in fact, I can think of one great one, which was 10 years ago, obviously, the attempts to create a national spot exchange in India, where we ended up with all these Pochemkin villages where the warehouses had front doors and there was actually nothing behind them. And only just this year we've had somebody found some piles of stones which were supposed to be metals in one of the London Metal Exchange warehouses. How did you go about interacting with that network? Did you have electronic warehouse receipts up front, or were you still on paper, or how did it go?
No, we were 100% paper. We don't have today even a warehouse act or a warehouse bill. And that leads me to another point, which I must just mention, is that the other strong foundation stone that we had was the rule of law. Therefore, we had very good contract law. And in my view, if you have a good contract law and a basis for that, you don't need any other additions like a warehouse act, because the basis was a contract. And the rule of law formed the basis of our exchange and helped in our credibility. And yes, it was difficult, many difficult negotiations with the storage owners, the silo owners, who thought that we were there to capture, as it were, their share of the market, and didn't see us as an exchange, but more as a trader, which is another point where I think a lot of exchanges in Africa are getting confused about being a neutral exchange and being a market player. And I think there's a very basic need to distinguish between the two of those. But we had a number of difficult negotiations with silo owners until they realized what we were really looking for. We had only one private silo owner, Jeff Allen, and he understood it, and we would have run with him as the only point of delivery. But what we did too, which is a little bit unusual, we thought we'd start with 4, 5, 6 delivery points, sort of on a Chicago basis. But we quickly realized that because of the vastness of the country, and to help farmers understand, we started with multiple delivery points, working off a central delivery point just outside of Joburg, and working with what we call a location differential, which has been difficult and caused a lot of problems over the years that I was there. It's still today. But the benefit of having those storage owners and what they brought to the market, we had to be very careful, because obviously the storage owners had quite a thin Chinese wall, because they were also trading in the market. So we had to manage that very carefully as well. But it was, in my view, added hugely to the credibility of the market.
So that's a very interesting point that you're making about, I think, also the differentiation with exchanges, and indeed coming, well, right now, live in criminal court in New York, we have none other than Sam Bankman-Friedman, who has been attempting to do, I think, a variation on the Chewbacca defense just over the course of the last few days, in terms of trying to confuse everybody about what a good guy he was, where what we can see is there was obviously a very, very mixed metaphor there in terms of how the exchange was interacting with the market maker, which he also happens to have owned. And I suppose, I mean, he's been incarcerated recently, and that leads us to, by a reasonably direct segue, someone who was a guest on this show some months ago, which was Patrick Young. Not me, not Patrick L. Young, but Patrick M1. And indeed, his is our book of the week, A Way Up. He has a magnificent workbook, which is, well, it's an attempt to try and help and break the cycle of incarceration against a certain group of people, often male, often coming from some form of a problem in terms of their background as a childhood, because they've been left behind or whatever. And it's high time, as Patrick said, we nullified this poverty incarceration two-feeder system. How? By dealing with the root, which is poverty. So how do you break the cycle of poverty? You may want to get out of jail or prison, but are you ready to get out of poverty? How? And the answers, ladies and gentlemen, can be found in our book of the week this week, A Way Up, Economic Development Post-Incarceration Workbook, from someone who did more than his fair share of time in jail, a very, very inspirational Patrick Young, who was a guest on an earlier IPO-VID. I thoroughly recommend this book, and I also recommend you go and check out IPO-VID episode 62, where he was the guest. Another great guest, actually, which just occurs to me, Rod, while you're talking about this, is that actually Barnabas Reynolds was our guest many, many months ago. And he's an absolutely phenomenal lawyer and legal eagle, advises many of the great exchanges around the world, etc. And I think he made a very, very good series of arguments, which you've just backed up beautifully, when discussing how important is the rule of law. And I think you're right. I mean, South Africa had a fantastic built-in advantage, because the contract law was very, very coherent. And as Barney Reynolds explained to us in, I think it was episode 20 of IPO-VID, it's a vital facet, particularly when it's based on something like the South African legal system, which has so much Anglo-Saxon common law within its fabric, which is therefore easy also for lawyers around the world to readily understand, and therefore makes a jurisdiction more attractive for people to deal in, which I think is vitally, vitally important. So, Rod, you were building this market, and I think, we've got a great question, actually. Anne Berg, thank you so much, Anne, for your question. It's lovely to see you. More importantly, we're looking forward to seeing you as a guest in a few weeks' time. So, Rod, if you don't like this question, you can get your own back then by asking Anne a difficult question at that stage. Anne Berg is saying, Rod, what do you consider the biggest challenges to price transmission and raising producer income in Africa?
Well, it is a great question, because I have been involved when I left SAFEX, which then obviously went across to the JSE and became a commodity part of the JSE. I did some consultancy in Africa, and this is really the question that's puzzled me, because I believe Africa, and I think, Anne, you're talking about north of South Africa. How do you do it? Why don't we see exchanges emerging and growing in African countries? And I think there's a number of reasons. I think we've touched on some of them. I think you have to understand the vast number of smallholder farmers in Africa, the difficulty that brings with regard to grading, the difficulty that brings with regard to storage and credibility in storage. And I, after many years of working in this area, I think that, a derivatives market, it's a sophisticated instrument, but I think it can be explained, and I think with a lot of people understand it, but it's also an expensive instrument. And options is a wonderful thing, but options can work out to be very, very expensive. And a lot of smallholder farmers in South Africa just will never be able to actually afford the cost of a derivatives market and being involved in a derivatives market. So I'm leaning more and more, believe it or not, because I'm an exchange man or an exchange person, I'm beginning to think that maybe vertical integration models in agriculture in South Africa is perhaps the way to go. Maybe not as widespread, but it certainly will, I think, raise producer incomes of certain groups in South Africa, and that might have a knock-on effect. But I don't know whether a central exchange, considering the cost of derivatives market, considering the storage facilities, the number of smallholder farmers, I don't know. I don't know how you do it, and I think that if you find out the answer, Anne, and I remember spending time with you in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know. I haven't got the answer. I think it's a very difficult question, but I think it's made difficult also because of the government role in Africa and the inconsistency therein.
Brilliant answer to a fantastic question. Really fantastic question. Brilliant answer. Thank you very, very much, Rod. Let me just offer a quick follow-up there. Now, you mentioned vertical integration. What different components are you thinking about in that kind of vertically integrated silo?
I think it's Olam in Nigeria, where a farmer is selected. Obviously, he has to be selected, but the input costs are then funded by the taker of the produce. So input costs are funded. So he has costs to produce, and then he has a fixed price which will be given. And obviously, people are making money along the way. But at least for that small group, there is a input cost being financed. There is a price risk taken out of the market. There's a price that he's given and a market that's already provided. And I think those are the components that perhaps are better served in a vertical integration model.
Interesting. And in fact, very interesting. Anne has offered a follow-up as well. She says, you refer to a market aggregator. Do you mean like a cooperative, she asks?
Yeah, it could be. It could well be a cooperative. But there seems to be, in my experience, a lot of distrust. And I think there's, credibility problems. In an opaque market, there's a lot of money to be made. And there's a lot of vested interests in many countries in Africa. Now, we started in South Africa, as we've been discussing for the last 30 minutes, with a clean sheet. We came out of a system where there were control boards, and the control boards disappeared, and all of a sudden, there was a problem to be addressed. The objective was, how do you manage price risk? And so we got in at the ground floor, so to speak, and I think that helped a lot. In many countries in Africa, there are large trading groups that are, I think, making a lot of money out of the opaqueness of the market.
Yes, opacity is definitely the friend of so many commodities trading groups right around the world, isn't it? It's quite incredible. So if I may, let's come back to something. I'm not asking for your specific opinion on this high-level discussion where they're talking about moving the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, merging that into the East African Exchange. But cross-border, as a general rule, cross-border exchanges in Africa for commodities, it strikes me there are lots of problems and issues, but you've had much more experience on the ground. Can they work? How do they work?
I've had experience in both the Ethiopian commodity market, which is largely a cash market. And a few years back, I went up there and they wanted to launch a futures contract in maize. And I tried my best to see what the demand was and the understanding. And I don't know in the last few years if they've managed to do it. I'm not sure. I also worked, as you probably know, for many years with the African exchange in Rwanda. So I think my opinion will be tinged by my experience there. So I really believe that an East African exchange might well work because you have similar product, you have a greater volume of product. I think you have an understanding across the markets. But the difficulty is, let me be perfectly honest with you. I think Rwanda has got huge talent, but it's a small country. It doesn't have the product. It cannot operate in East Africa without Kenya and Uganda, for that matter. But yet, I felt in my years working there that although Kenya liked the idea of a East African commodity exchange, they only liked it if they were in charge. Now, I could be mistaken, but that's what I came away with. There wasn't until you get to a basis where people are prepared to work together, then I think you're going to have some difficulty in cross-border exchanges. Now, I know there's a lot of other practical elements like, grading, having delivery points in various countries and whether the grain is actually the same with grading and that. And then also, the border control. Immediately there's a shortage of maize, the government steps in. And I'll never forget speaking at a conference where the Minister of Agriculture came up to me and he said to me, do I have children? I said, yes, I do. He said, your responsibility as a father is to look after your children. He said, my responsibility as a Minister of Agriculture is to make sure my children, in other words, the nation, has food. Therefore, I will do anything in pursuit of that. And so you have a system where you have controls of import, you can have controls of export. I was talking in a conference in Kenya once in Nairobi, and I said, do you have export limitation at the moment? And half the audience said yes, and half the audience said no. And the answer was the right hand really didn't know what the left hand was doing. And some people could export, some people could import. It all depended who you were. And until there's clarity in that with regard to what the government wants to achieve, and there's an alignment of governments in an area, I think it's going to be very difficult to have cross-border exchanges in Africa.
That's a very, very interesting perspective, and I appreciate
it. With this, but that's my view. Yeah.
No, I mean, I appreciate it because one of the things that strikes me is when you look at even doing business in some of the larger African nations, you find incredible differentiations from one province or region or state to the next. Yes. And I presume that's also feeding through into agriculture. And therefore, it becomes incredibly difficult because although the United States of America may have some very bizarre rules from one place to the next, such as de facto criminalizing you if you decide to post a bottle of wine to your friend in the neighboring state, nonetheless, most of the actual business-to-business rules are homogeneous, and therefore that's why they can achieve it. I'm also interested, I mean, the localization of pricing. Now, you talked about how you came up with this interesting transport facet into the pricing that therefore made some sort of an equalizing effect. But I'm very curious because, say, for example, India, and I'm not looking to discuss India per se, but I mean, India, a huge subcontinental nation, even larger than South Africa. And it strikes me their regulators always have this obsession about getting one national price. And I just cannot in my head understand how you can have the same price in Kerala as you can have in the mountains in the northeastern corner. And yet that's something they strive for. It seems to me that you're always going to end up with some degree of range of pricing, even on the same quality product, simply because it's could be 1,000 miles inland, or it could be right bang next door to a massive container port where it can be sent around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. If you go back in South African history and you had the maize board set the price. It was a pan-geographic price. It was the price for maize produced anywhere in South Africa, which doesn't make any economic sense. Coupled with that, it was the same price for white maize as for yellow maize. For those who are not educated, we have two types of corn, the white corn and the yellow corn. In the sense, although to an extent interchangeable, they are largely different product. And so you had the same price set for both commodities. So what the derivatives market and what we did at Safex, we also did a lot of education with regard to price differentials and the fact that there is a difference in price depending where you are. What was interesting, just on this, Patrick, when I did an agricultural economics degree, which actually, as I mentioned at the start of the show, was my launch into agriculture. I think that the discussion on the setting of the maize price in South Africa was about a 10-minute part of one session, at university. Now you have a whole course on futures markets and the maize price and how the maize price is set. And I think that, I don't believe setting up an exchange or Safex was such a major contribution. I was helped along with some good people like Chris Sturgis. I had the right means on which to work. I had a motor car that could get me around. But what I think was the biggest achievement was to be able to change people's thinking with regard to how the market works and the opportunities that the market can provide. I think that is great. And when I hear of universities running courses on how the maize price is determined, I think that I get a little bit of warmth in my heart from that.
Yes, it's fascinating because, as you say, originally you used to have that whiteboard that sat in the boot of your car and you went all the way around the country and you went through, several thousand different markers every year, drawing the same diagrams for everybody as you went to on your flip over chart. And you look at how much more sophisticated things have come, and certainly how even when you look at retail channels on YouTube nowadays, some of them are absolute hucksters, but there are a great many people who are finding their niche, educating people in a coherent fashion about derivatives. And that's certainly something that's been an enormous change since you and I were remotely on the road 25 years ago, or the better part of 25 years ago. You mentioned, of course, Chris Sturgis. Chris Sturgis has also been a guest on IPO-VID, ladies and gentlemen. If you remember, that episode is a great watch. He's a little bit further to the south of you these days, I do believe, closer to the coast, but it was a really, really great discussion. So Rod, you mentioned your experience in running around other nations within Africa and so on. One of the things I find very frustrating is that, particularly when I'm going out talking to people, a lot of people go, well, haven't all the exchanges that we ever need been built? And aren't they all being bought by, the Intercontinental Exchange or one of these massive international global players in tier one of Young's pyramid, whether it be ICE, the CME or whatever? I firmly believe there are huge numbers of opportunities for small and niche exchanges still to be built out there. And I'm curious what your thinking is, given the fact that you're in the midst of this amazing breadbasket developing continent of Africa.
Patrick, I agree with you. I don't think you're looking at major exchanges. I think you're looking at small niche exchanges. I think too much emphasis is placed these days. And remember, I guess I'm past my sell-by date, but there's too much concentration on turnover, making money. This idea that an exchange can make a lot of money. The success of an exchange is determined not by how much money they make, but whether they are serving the interests of the participants, primarily managing price risk. And I think that there will always be a need to manage price risk in smaller commodities, in places, in niche markets. If you have credibility, then I do believe there's roles for well-run smaller markets in commodities.
You are a man absolutely after my own heart. It's one of the biggest arguments that I see these days. I think that the issue is that people have become obsessed with the idea, whether it's a cash market or a derivatives market, that they have to be what I call super liquid. They have to be trading every nanosecond and doing 50,000 contracts a day. Whereas if they can manage to transfer risk and trade 10 contracts a day or even 10 contracts a week on a relatively short-term basis, it actually does not matter. And there's a way to build, I would agree, not the world's most profitable structures, because those are the things that trade day in, day out. But you can build something that actually will support an ecosystem and at the same time can be a reasonable business. So it's great to hear, Rod. I mean, I'm really, really encouraged, because I think that's something, it's a message people have to understand, that actually the pyramid of exchanges, Young's pyramid of exchanges, it has been concentrating up top, but actually we're seeing the base of that exchange pyramid expanding at all points in time. And that's something that a lot of people don't readily understand, particularly if they're reading just the financial newspapers, which are only interested in perhaps the top 7 or 8 names. So, I mean, Rod, look, it's been an absolutely marvelous conversation. I have this terrible fear that if we carry on, we'll go on for about another 3 weeks without any difficulty whatsoever. And it's just too interesting. But I really want to ask you the question. Well, when we first met, actually, it was just after my book had first came out, A Capital Market Revolution, 1999. So tell me, Rod Blondin, we've been on the road with you for the course of the last hour, talking about your illustrious and incredible career. Rod, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Well, Patrick, it's something that doesn't keep me up at night, I can tell you that. Although I do wish that I was clever enough to point you in any direction. I think the word revolution, and I know you like words and you're very good with words. I think revolution might sound very sexy and exciting, but I think there's more evolution than revolution. I'm a commodity guy, so let me give you a commodity view. I think that if there are any commodities left worth exploring, they are going to be environmentally or green-based, something like fresh water. I think where there's a scarcity and where maybe we need some type of market evolution to address that, or even something like seaweed, which I believe, never tasted it except in sushi. Maybe that's a commodity of the future, but something environmentally. But I think my fear lies more, I don't think the markets in any way are going to be able to escape AI. Now, when I was growing up, AI stood for artificial insemination, but I know now that it stands for artificial intelligence. And I think that artificial intelligence is going to make or have some type of impact on the capital market. And I hope it's a positive impact and not a negative impact.
That's a fascinating angle altogether. And from one AI, which was vitally important during the course of the 60s and the 70s, particularly in the markets for beef, etc., to another kind of AI that has become vitally important into the modern day. I want to say thank you very, very much, Rod Blondin. I'd love to actually have you come back at some stage and we can talk a little bit more about some of these fascinating commodity topics, because you break it down so beautifully. And that's why I was really keen to have you on the show, Rod, even though you're not so active day in, day out in the field. But you've always been a man who spoke his mind, and you've always been great at breaking things down and explaining very, very elegantly. Thank you very much for being part of the show. Next week, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have guest John Ensley. John Ensley is going to be discussing how to bank on yourself. Completely different topic altogether. We're looking at the whole art of how people can manage to better manage their finances with someone who's been a leading figure in trying to rethink how you can adopt an alternative strategy towards investment with your personal finances in the USA, something I think will be of interest to everybody amongst our community. Let me just say finally, thank you very, very much to Fernando, Janella, Jamil, our production team today. A huge thanks to Anne Berg for that brilliant question altogether, which we really, really appreciated. Also, I really appreciated all of your lovely messages during the course of the week. I had a lovely weekend, thank you very much, shouting at the traffic in Malta, or as it's known, commentating on the Mdina Grand Prix historic car races. It was quite magnificent. But now, ladies and gentlemen, Well, what have we proven today? Rod has kept telling us that the most exciting thing to bear in mind are networks. And I think it's very important to bear in mind, here we are today in Malta, Rod's in South Africa, through networks such as the different futures exchanges that we've been involved in, and the AFM, the Association of Futures Markets, where we had, of course, guests from amongst their directorate quite recently celebrating their great anniversary. It's marvelous because the network of body of evidence of people around the world, and I love that way that you neatly threw in the fact that you were there talking to Anne Berg, and the last time you'd been meeting up was somewhere like Trinidad and Tobago, the exotically wonderful world of esoteric commodities, ladies and gentlemen. Rod Blondin, thank you very, very much for joining the show. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be back next Tuesday. I'll be somewhere completely different by then as I globe trot around for the course of this month. My name is Patrick L. Young. I want to say thank you very much for watching IPO-VID. Don't forget to catch Exchange Invest. And in fact, tomorrow we've got that fascinating discussion. Is this the touch paper under crypto version 1.0? I think it might be. More to be unveiled in BitCarnage tomorrow. My name is Patrick L. Young. Have a great week in life and markets. See you next week.